As Liliana mentioned, I'm the Children's Services Manager at Peace River Center, and I've worked in a lot of different areas of Peace River Center, but my heart belongs to the kids. And I think it's because anytime you're doing work with children, you're doing work with families. And what an honor to be able to really support and strengthen family units. I think that's my calling and the team that I serve with. We love creating opportunities for families to grow, because that's where you build the resilience. It's in the family. And so today we're going to be talking about trauma. We're going to be talking about lots of different things. And I'm also going to go over a couple of personal stories. So I have two kids. I don't know if any of you guys have kids that are on the webinar, but I have a 4-year-old little boy and I have a 6-year-old girl. And I think that some of our best experiments are in our own family. And so the last couple of years, we've had a couple of really unusual traumatic. So you have 3 boys. I have 1 boy, and I feel like sometimes it's like they're having 3 boys, so I can understand that. But we've had a couple of really strange traumas, and I don't say this for you to hold my trauma for me, but I feel like sometimes the best ways to learn is to provide really concrete examples. And so as we go through, I'm going to give like little examples here and there, but just to give you a snapshot. So I have a son, he just turned 4 in March, and he was born 6 weeks premature. And so my water broke at 31 weeks. I was rushed to the hospital and immediately admitted. And that was the first time that my daughter did not know that I was not coming home with her, right? I tucked her in every night her whole life. And all of a sudden I'm in the hospital, and am I gonna die? And is she ever gonna see her brother? And that was trauma for her. A couple of years later, so that was 2017, 2019, I believe, we were home getting ready for work, and we actually had a house fire. Our house was on fire while we were in it. We had no clue. I heard someone banging on the doors. I thought, oh my gosh, someone's breaking into my house at 7:30 in the morning. And we go outside and the roof's on fire. Again, we completely were able to, be restored and recover, still trauma. And so fortunately, I have those skills, and I had the ability to, like, how do I regulate? How do I, monitor my family? How do I make sure that they're okay? But even, we'll talk a little bit later on, even with the best circumstances and the best laid plans, trauma happens to everybody, and it happens in a variety of ways. And just because something happened to you, it doesn't mean that you have to stay stuck in the victim mentality, right? At Peace River Center, the desire of my heart is to help people recover and go through hard things, and to move them from being a victim to a survivor to an overcomer. So not only can you go through hard things, you can develop that resilience, and you can say, hey, look through what I've gone through. I know the steps. Let me help you walk through it too, because I've been there. And so I think there is an element and an honor of going through something hard, because you can help someone else walk through it too. So as I go through this, please know there's times for questions, there's time for answers, and I want you to be able to have that practical application for what does trauma really look like in the day-to-day. And even when you do everything right, we cannot escape things that happen to us. Bad things will happen, but there's also people to step in and help you grow and help you heal and help support you along the way. So let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen, and please let me know if you can see everything okay. I want to give a shout out to Jessica Lawson. She helped me make my presentation beautiful. So if it looks impressive at all, it's because of Jessica Lawson. So we're going to go over.
It's on there and we can see it good.
Can you see it? Yay. Yeah. So we're going to go over the ACEs. We're going to go over trauma and going over building resiliency. So when the main thing, talking about trauma, talking about types of trauma, effects, risk factors, protective barriers, and then the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. So when you think of the word trauma, what do you think? Whenever I'm working with kids, I usually see a lot of these pop out at me. Sometimes bullying, cyberbullying, school violence, sometimes natural disasters. Anytime hurricanes come through this area, we see anxiety spike in the kids that we serve. As I mentioned, fires. Experiencing homelessness, abuse, neglect, those are big ones, but also economic stress, poverty, right? COVID has hit everybody really hard. A lot of people that we serve work in the hospitality industry or the service industry, so we're all struggling in different ways. Okay, sorry, my clicker isn't working. There we go. So when we think of trauma, we're looking at individual trauma results from an event. So something happened. It might be an isolated incident, it might be a series of events or a set of circumstances that you experience. Now, for it to kind of set in as trauma, that experience has to be seen as harmful. We go through things every day and we don't remember half of them, unless they have an impact. So for something to be traumatic, something happened, we experienced it in a negative, harmful way that might have seemed life-threatening at the time, and it has adverse effects. So it has effects on our functioning, on our mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So when you look at trauma, as we said before, you've got an event, something happened, you have an experience, and then how did it affect you? So an event can be a lot of things. Sometimes it's, as we said before, one thing. It could be frightening. It could be a violent event. And it could pose a threat to a child, or it could seem to be a threat. Whenever we're working with kids that have gone through a trauma, you can have the child's perception of what happened and then the caregiver's perception. And the caregiver may be thinking, well, that's nothing. Well, I don't know why that would be affecting him. He's probably fine. It didn't affect me at all. It doesn't matter how it affected you if you're not the one who's experiencing the trauma. It's the perception of the child. If it affected them, it affected them. It's the same way whenever we're working with clients who go through psychosis. Even if you know that the delusional thinking or the hallucination that they're experiencing isn't real, it doesn't change how their body is experiencing it. But the body doesn't understand. So they're going to respond just as if though it was actually a life-threatening event. When children have been in situations where they fear for their lives, maybe they witness violence like domestic violence, bereavement, if you've lost a loved one, if you've lost a pet, if someone that you loved has moved away, all of these things can create instances of traumatic stress. Now, another thing would be witnessing a trauma that has happened to a security figure, a close loved one. So for a lot of kids, and the one that mentioned you have 3 boys, for children, a lot of their security and their identity is wrapped up in their primary caregiver, right? So if the safety, if the security of my caregiver is jeopardized, by correlation, mine is too. And so there's a sense of fear that comes with if I see my caregiver hurt or my caregiver struggling. So at this point, as a parent or as a caregiver, if I'm having some concerns about my child, my first question, if you look at the bottom of the screen to pause and reflect, did something happen? Did something happen to my child? I'm seeing some symptoms. I don't know what's going on. Is it possible that something happened? And it may have happened not at home. You may not know. And that's why it's so important. We'll talk a little bit later about some ways just to develop resiliency. But one of the ways is that I'm constantly looking for opportunities with my children, with my family, to foster healthy communication. Every single day, I'm checking in. Tell me about your day. Tell me the part that was most challenging. Tell me the part that brought you the most joy. Tell me something that you're proud about. They get so annoyed with all of my questions, but I want to know about your day. Whenever we're building treatment plans with families and kids, and I see a break in the rapport and the connection, one of the best ways that we look at fusing that connection back together is just by talking. So in the treatment plan, we'll write in, okay, I want you to have a daily check-in every single day. Tell me the challenges. Tell me the things that brought joys. And different people call them different things, highs and lows, mountains and valleys, the best part of your day, the worst part of your day, but just a starting point of talking about your day. Because if you're not talking, you're going to miss something. So other events, sometimes abuse or neglect. Now this could be physical, sexual, psychological. Now I'll stop here for a second and say, so I'm on a couple of community committees, and one is the Youth at Risk Committee. So, we meet together and we, DCF, DJJ, all the local agencies, we get together and say, okay, who are the kids that are struggling and how can we support and help them? And I will say, I've been so impressed with the Department of Children and Families within the last maybe 5 years, because they are understanding mental health and they are understanding trauma. And before, if you made an abuse report call and it was physical abuse or sexual abuse, well, absolutely, those would get accepted. But it was so hard to identify the psychological or the emotional abuse. And now they're understanding, well, that can create just as much trauma as the physical and the sexual abuse. And so I really appreciate how they're honoring mental health and trauma in that area. Sometimes we mentioned before, natural disasters, terrorism, family, community violence, also mental illness. And so we talk about physical wellness a lot, if you've had a bodily injury, a serious medical condition, but if there's a co-occurring mental illness or a substance misuse, not only for the child, but also for the caregiver, that can be a big event. I've seen kids struggle, with their parents being deployed if they're in the military, or even a parental loss, divorce, separation, injury. All of these things affect the dynamics and how kids are struggling and coping with their day-to-day life. So then you have the experience. Now, the experience refers to your child's unique perception of what happened. Remember what I said before, your perception is important, but their perception determines how their body reacts to the stress and trauma. And so you're looking at how do they understand the situation? Now, I'll stop here and say all the time when we've had kids go through really, really hard things, or maybe the family is going through something hard, it's a natural instinct to want to protect your kid, to want to shield them from the things that go on in life. And sometimes that's done to a detrimental level. What I always try to, tell my parents is you want to have age appropriate conversations about what's going on with your children, always age appropriate, but they're going to know if something is going on. They're going to know if something is wrong or something is off. And if you don't give them some framework about what is going on or what happened, they're going to fill in the blanks themselves. And usually whatever they fill the blanks in, it's going to be way worse than the reality of what happened. And so what I always tell my daughter, what I always tell my clients that I serve is, you are capable and strong of doing hard things. And this is hard and it's not fair. And, I'm so sorry that you're having to walk through this, but you are strong and resilient, and we will give you the skills that you need to walk through this. And these are hard conversations. In a few minutes, we'll be talking about trauma reminders when you've got abuse or neglect, and there's court proceedings or there are criminal proceedings that are involved. Sometimes they have to have testimony. Sometimes they have to have exams or evaluations. Those are hard things, but we are raising our kids to be strong people who can do hard things because they're not doing it by themselves. So the experience continued. Sometimes you see the physical and sometimes you see the physiological reactions that can happen. So the physical, basically, what happened to your body, and the physiological, how is your body reacting to what happened? So sometimes you see that heart pounding, that vomiting, that hypervigilance. Have you ever been at home at night and you hear a noise? Maybe it's the refrigerator and every single hair on your body stands straight up. And even though you convince yourself it's just the refrigerator, there's not an instantaneous moment of like every hair goes back down. It takes a minute to shake that feeling. It's the same things with kids in trauma. If they've gone through something difficult, that they feel that hypervigilant state, it takes a while for them to regulate on their own if they know how to regulate. It's not uncommon for kids to revert back to baby talk. It's not uncommon for disruptions in sleep and appetite. Maybe they've been completely potty trained and now all of a sudden they're wetting the bed again, right? So those are very common things when you've gone through trauma. I've seen it manifest in headaches, in stomach aches, and constipation, and all sorts of things. So as a caregiver here, I would stop and say, okay, I've determined that my child has gone through something difficult, but how are they experiencing that? Could they be experiencing any of these emotions that are listed above? Could they have any physical symptoms that are going on? Could this maybe be associated with this? The body is all connected, right? And so that the head and the body and the mind, all these things are connected. And so, it's the same if you have a really, really hard day and you're emotionally drained, it's going to affect your body. I know with me, when I have a rough day, my neck gets so tight, right? And my muscles get tight and I get tired. It's all connected. And it's really easy to miss if you're not looking for that connection. So then we have the effect. So how does this event, how does this experience create an effect that is lasting on the child? So it could be short-term, it could be long-term, it could show up immediately, it could show up a little bit later. So we talked about, I've had a couple of instances of trauma. Well, last week I was in a car accident. And so on Tuesday, my daughter and I, we were in a car accident and we're both perfectly fine, just a couple of scrapes. But on Tuesday, I felt okay. That adrenaline was pumping. Wednesday, I felt okay. Thursday, it hit me. And so if any of you can kind of relate, sometimes the effects of trauma are not right away. Right? Sometimes they are right away and they're fleeting. Sometimes they're not. It just depends. Everybody is case by case. And so I think that in that moment, it's important to have grace for yourself, to have grace for your kid, and really just monitor and see, okay, I know what my kid is like. I know the baseline for my child. And so I'm kind of monitoring now. I'm watching them. How is how they're acting right now different from who I know them to be? Are they eating more or less? Are they sleeping more or less? Are they more moody? Are they less moody? Are they more isolated? Are they more detached? What's going on? And I think that if you're looking at the differences for your child, you're going to be able to pick up on those red flags that might be different, because if we start comparing kids, not everybody's going to look the same when they go through trauma. So as a parent, you're going to ask, or a caregiver, how have they changed? In what ways? Could it be related to the event that happened? So when we think about trauma in general, there's different types of trauma. So you have acute trauma, and that is a single isolated incident. That is a one thing. So that is car accident. That is a home invasion. That is an instance of abuse or neglect, a one-time thing. You know the start date and you know the stop. Then you have chronic trauma, and that is just repeated traumas over and over and over and over. Sometimes we see this whenever we're dealing with sexual abuse, and we see grooming. Sometimes we see this in toxic relationships where maybe you have domestic violence. If you talk to anyone who's survived a domestic violence relationship, typically they say it did not start out in a negative fashion, right? It eventually morphed to something that was incredibly toxic. Then you have complex trauma. That is not only the exposure to the chronic trauma, trauma after trauma after trauma, but it's also the impact that it has on the individual. So for example, if a child has experienced intense childhood trauma, trauma after trauma after trauma, it could be that they have a hard time opening up. It could be that they have a hard time trusting. It could be that they have difficulty concentrating. Maybe their grades are struggling. Maybe they have difficulty advocating for themselves. Maybe you see, a correlation with their ability to get a good job because they don't advocate. They don't ask questions. They don't know how to be proactive or to be confident. That's related to back to their chronic trauma. I see this a lot with parents that we work with that have survived a domestic violence relationship. Sometimes it's really hard if you've been told your whole life that you're nothing. If you've been told your whole life that you're, you don't matter, or your thoughts are worthless. Moving from that to a situation to where you have to advocate for yourself, you have to advocate for your kid, it can be really hard to flip that switch. But if you have, the right support and the right strategies, and you reframe some of those thoughts in your mind and your heart, there is resilience and there's recovery that can happen. So then you have system-induced trauma, and system-induced trauma, it happens every day. Whenever you're hospitalized because of an injury, whenever, you're Baker acted, if you have to be placed in DCF custody, these are things that have to happen for the safety, and sometimes for the life-changing and life-saving measures that need to be, taken. They're still traumatic. In the middle, you have vicarious trauma. Now, vicarious trauma is tricky because as caregivers, as service providers, why are we in these roles? Because we care, because we want to help, right? We walk into these roles because we want to serve and we want to make things better for the people around us. And you've got to be very careful because everyone has their own trauma. Of course we do. But when you're dealing with someone else who also has their own trauma, it's very easy for your traumas to become enmeshed. And so what I always tell my new therapist is that when you are entering into a therapeutic relationship, you need to really be very clear about where you end and your client begins, because it's important to empathize with your kids, with your family, with your clients. Of course it is, right? But when their trauma starts to become your trauma, when you look at that boundary and you can't find it because it's so blurry, then who are you helping, right? You can't help hold someone up if you're also holding their trauma, because then you start to get crushed. And, I know this is true because, whenever I have, family members that call me, or when I have friends that call me, I know when I'm able to listen to their issue and give them a thoughtful, considerate, response. And I also know whenever I'm listening to their issue and I get so angry on their behalf that I can't think clearly. That is an example of that enmeshment, because I'm not thinking clearly, because now it's my trauma. Now it's my fight. Now, the problem with vicarious trauma is that there's no room for your own self-care, right? Because you and them are in it together on the same level. And so then that very quickly can lead to compassion fatigue, which also leads to burnout. So trauma reminders, I told you we get here. So trauma is so interesting because what I have found to be true is that it's so intertwined with our senses. And that's why whenever we have trauma triggers or trauma reminders, it typically is connected to a sensory experience. Think about the last time you were in the car and you heard a song on the radio and it brought you back to a memory that you probably haven't thought about in 10 years, or you smell something and immediately you can remember something from childhood, right? It's not always bad reminders, right? Sometimes the senses give us good reminders, but they also can really create a situation to where trauma triggers and trauma reminders occur. Now, some of these things we can avoid. So if you maybe had something happen at a certain place, maybe if you don't go to that place until you're able to process your trauma, but some things can't be escaped. Years ago, I worked with a family where there had been abuse in the home. And it was, I think, a home invasion had occurred, right? And so it was a terrible event, lots of fear, lots of work to be done. And that person had been arrested, that person was incarcerated, no longer a threat to this family. But every single time that child would go home from school, they'd come back to this house, to those colors of this wall, and they would be brought back to that home invasion, right? So every time they came home, they would be triggered because they'd be going back to really the scene of the crime. Some things you can't escape. I told you a couple of years ago, our family had experienced a house fire. Now our house, and we're in a much better place now. We were able to completely rebuild. Everything that was lost was restored tenfold. So we are in a good place. But at the time, it was a complete, complete loss. And I thought, okay, I wonder how this is going to affect my children. We're okay, we're safe, nobody was injured, but how is this going to affect them? How is this going to affect me? And so what I noticed for me, I was most annoyed, and there's no judgment here. I was most annoyed because whenever I relocated, there was a different route to work, a different route to school, and I had to do a different route to a new grocery store. And so what a silly thing, right? And so we have our routine. I have my favorite grocery store that I go to, and I know where all the things are that I like to buy. And that was out of the way now. So I had to stop at a new grocery store. And I can remember going into that grocery store being so annoyed that I don't know where anything is, and this is not my grocery store, and the people aren't the same people. And that was one of the biggest just day-to-day trauma reminders of, oh yeah, we had a house fire. Like, oh yeah, we're dealing with this stuff. Everybody's safe, everybody's fine, all of our stuff was restored. But we have to live in this new place for a year. And I don't like this part. And for my daughter at the time, she was, I want to say she was 4.5 maybe. Her biggest thing was she would go to the place we were renting, and every time it was bath time, she would have the biggest tantrum you could even imagine. And I'm thinking, what is going on? They're not upset about their toys. They're not upset about having to sleep in a new bed. It was because in our old house, we had a detachable shower head. And when I would wash her hair at night, I would angle it so none of the water would get in her eyes. And at this new place, it was a fixed shower head. And so it didn't even occur to me. That was one of her biggest trauma reminders. And it was such a good lesson for me that even for someone, I have got letters behind my name, right? And I do trauma all day long. And I know all the steps and I know all the things to look for. It did not occur to me that the shower head would be one of her biggest triggers. So I got on online, I found one at Ace Hardware. We went immediately and we replaced that shower head and it went away. And that was one of the biggest things. And so of course, it's not always that simple, right? But sometimes for kids, it's little things. And what was such a good lesson to remember is that she did not know how to verbalize that at 4 years old. All she knew was something's different and I don't like it. And I think about kids that we serve in foster care and kids that we serve that maybe, they have a death of a loved one and they have to be displaced for whatever reason. Little things like that they're experiencing every day. And from the outside looking in, well, look at that tantrum. Well, they just need to act right. Well, don't they know that this is hard for everybody? On the inside looking out, my whole world is upside down. And this is, one of the things at the end of the day that I love to do to relax. And this is making it worse for me. And I don't know how to tell my safe person how to make it better. And so little things like that, it's just such a good reminder. And so when I have parents or when I have caregivers that we're talking with and we go through their daily routine and they tell me about these outbursts, I always look to see, okay, what is causing these outbursts? And sometimes it's so simple. And it's not just that they're being bad. It's not just that, they're moody or they're in a bad mood. People do what makes sense to them. And if you're seeing an aggressive outburst, if you're seeing some dysfunction, what's underneath that dysfunction? And sometimes it'll surprise you like it did for me in this instance. All right, so the effects of childhood trauma. This is my son. He is, I forget how old he was there. I think it probably was about 6 months. He was a giant child. But I wanted to go into the effects of childhood trauma from ages 0 to 2, because of course, depending on the age, it's going to present differently, right? So when you're dealing with trauma for kids 0 to 2, they're going to have poor verbal skills. Now, sometimes they may not have any verbal skills. And so you're looking at eye contact, right? You're looking at any type of verbal communication to let you know, I'm scared, I'm hungry, I'm happy, I'm okay. It's going to differ depending on the age. You're also going to see memory issues, right? So maybe you have a child that they know X, Y, and Z, but they're not retaining that information. Or you tell them to go do something, or you tell them not to do something, and you're just seeing really challenging behavior because they're not holding on to those commands or those memories. Sometimes they have issues with appetite, low weight, and increased weight, sometimes digestive problems. They may scream or cry excessively. And what that looks like to me typically is my body is so dysregulated and I do not know how to calm down. Please help me. What it looks like to a parent is I'm doing everything that I know how to do and it's not working and I'm failing and I don't know how to help my kid feel better and they just won't stop screaming. And sometimes that can be really disheartening for a parent, especially if you're a new parent. And that's where that vicarious trauma comes in of their trauma is pulling me into trauma and I don't know how to separate myself so I can hold their feelings, right? And so that's where you take a breath and you sit your baby down and you take a shower and you know your baby is safe and then you come back, or you call a trusted loved one or friend to tag out so you can have a minute because your baby needs to be safe, but you also need to be in a safe space in your mind and your heart. And sometimes we all need help. So moving on to the next, this is my daughter. This is when she was about 4. So kids 3 to 6, they present a little bit differently. It's a little bit easier sometimes because they are able to talk, but there is a whole nother, collection of challenges because at this time, they're typically in school or preschool. So they might have difficulties focusing. They might develop learning disabilities if they're not being stimulated. They might show poor social skills, poor communication skills, poor problem solving. What we see sometimes is they mimic whatever abuse or neglect is going on in the home. So you might see some verbal abuse, you might see some acting out in social situations, maybe some physical abuse. It's really hard sometimes for kids to learn how to trust or learn how to do that give and take, shared, teamwork if they don't see themselves as part of a team at home. And so around this age, they're really developing their sense of identity. Who am I, of myself, but also, that autonomous who am I, but also who am I in relation to a team? Who am I in relation to a family? How does what I do affect, the bigger part? This is really where you're seeing that kind of like become concrete. And if they don't have that sense of security at home, it's really hard to gain it at school. They might lack self-confidence, but you also may see those, physical manifestations of trauma, the stomach aches, the headaches, the constipation, the body aches. So I want you to take a look at this screen and you see another breakdown of different ways that trauma might manifest for kids depending on their age. So you've got preschool, elementary, and the middle and high school. So just take a second. You'll see across the board, we have issues with eating. Across the board, we have issues with anxiety, sometimes being, afraid of being separated from a caregiver, sometimes being, additionally clingy to a parent or caregiver, sometimes isolating. Usually what I see with the teenage years and the middle school years, there's that sense of autonomy to where they may not gravitate towards the teacher or the parent. It typically is more towards their peers because that's where they identify. But I also see, with the kids we mentioned before, baby talk, bedwetting, nightmares, recreating the trauma through play, recreating the trauma through art therapy. One of my favorite things to do with kids who have gone through trauma, we do a lot of art therapy because they may not be able to verbalize it, but you'd be surprised what they can draw. And it's in there. They have to get it out to be able to process it. What I see sometimes with the older kids is sometimes they develop eating disorders. Sometimes they develop what we call non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors, such as cutting. And I thought long and hard about this. And, you know, what I think is true, there's always exceptions, but I feel like what is going on there is if your world is spinning out of control, that is one way to feel like you're gaining a sense of control of yourself back. Is it healthy? Absolutely not. But whenever I've worked and spoken with kids that are struggling with eating disorders or even the self-injurious behavior, it's just kind of to recenter and have that sense of control because the world around them feels out of control at the time. So I want you to take a look at this. This is a PET scan of a brain. And on the left, what you're going to see is a scan of a healthy brain, right? So typically whenever we're looking at scans like this, we're looking at lots of color, lots of activity. That's showing you an active brain. And so this is, just a normal, relatively normal, healthy child. Well, on the right, you have, similar age scan of a child who was put into foster care very soon after birth. And what you see here is not as much color, not as much activity. And what I would wager here is that you've got a kid who is constantly in a hypervigilant state. Because notice all of this darker, like the black where the temporal lobes are, right? So your decision making, your thought process, your brainstorming. And so what I see here is typically we see kids that are not stimulated during early childhood. They do have issues with learning disabilities. They do have issues with emotional and cognitive problems. And why might that be? So when you're dealing with kids, a lot of what they experience, it teaches them, problem solving, it teaches them, coping skills. And if you're not learning, right, you're not growing. And what we know to be true with trauma in the brain is that a brain that is stressed, a brain that is going through consistent trauma is not a brain that is rested and is not a brain that is learning. It is a brain that is in survival mode. And think about the last time that you were so flustered or so incredibly stressed. Were you retaining any of the information that was thrown on you at that time? Probably not. And so when I work with kids that have gone through trauma, we'll talk about, okay, tell me what happened. Why do you think you handled that way? And they look at me with these blank stares and they say, I don't know. And I would agree. I think that a lot of it is not premeditated, those aggressive outbursts. I think it's because they're in that survival, fight, flight, or freeze, hypervigilant state of I am just trying to survive. I am just trying to hold on. I'm not thinking about the consequences. I'm not thinking about next week or even the next 5 minutes. I'm thinking about right now. And so there's not that higher level of brainstorming and troubleshooting and problem solving. It's survival. And you can see it in the scans of the brain. So we're going to stop here because I've been talking to you guys for about 30 minutes. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Yes, there are a couple questions. So how does hypersensitivity or hypersensitive people react to trauma? Is it more, I guess, intensified?
Sure. So I would say when we're dealing with trauma, and everybody is different, right? Everybody's case by case, but if there's already an underlying condition, whether it be a mental health condition, whether it be a medical condition, if there's already something underlying going on, any stress, any trauma is going to exacerbate what's already there. And we think about if you already have a back injury, right, and you fall, well, it's going to be even worse because of that underlying condition. So it's the same thing with mental health. It's going to get worse. If you're already a naturally melancholic person, if you're already a naturally anxious person, what happens during the holidays, right? What happens when you have a big assignment? What do you do? And I think that that's where it's really important to be very honest with what are my coping skills? What are my self-care, right? When I'm having a stressful time, what do I do? What works? What makes it better? And so if you already know, okay, this is my safe person to call. Okay, this is what I need to do to get back on track to regulate, then you'll have those safety plan safeguards in place. So when that hard time comes, you'll know what to do to regulate. Good question.
Also, thank you, Tiffany. When you talked about vicarious trauma,
Yeah,
vicarious.
vicarious trauma, sure.
So is that like secondary trauma? And would that also be, for example, if a brother or a sister has witnessed their brother or sister experience a traumatic event and how they react to their brother or sister, is that kind of a secondary or vicarious?
Yeah, so I think that the big answer is yes, but also it depends. So if if you have experienced a trauma, maybe it didn't happen directly to you, but you witnessed it, then absolutely that's trauma. That's trauma in its own right. Now, if someone has a trauma and you are serving as their caregiver, if someone has a trauma and you are serving as their therapist or their friend, it would be very, easy for that trauma to affect you in a negative way, and that's where you're seeing the vicarious trauma. So not something that you witnessed, but something that you're stepping in to help them as a caregiver or as a provider.
Very good. Thank you. That's all the questions for now.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. Any other questions, just let me know. So then moving on to the next section, we're going to be talking about ACEs. So adverse childhood experiences, also called ACEs. So years and years ago, someone did a study and they found that there was a strong correlation with people who had high levels of medical conditions, death by suicide, chronic health problems, mental illness, substance misuse, negative job impact, all of these things. And it all correlated to traumatic events during childhood. Now, we already know that the things in our childhood impact who we are as people, right? We all have things that we have to overcome. But I think that there wasn't this thought of like, oh no, it really impacts it to the point where there's research and evidence and studies that show this isn't just like a common truth that we know, there's evidence to back it up. And so what we found is that when these key things happen during childhood, there's an exponentially higher rate of those adverse experiences to happen later on in life. So we're looking at maybe as a child, if you experienced violence or abuse, witnessing violence in the home or in the community, having a family member attempt or die by suicide, having substance misuse or mental health problems, not only for yourself, but also for a caregiver, or having instability in the home. Now, this could be having a parent incarcerated. This could be having a parent separate or divorce, so living in a one-parent household. And not to say that a one-parent household cannot be supportive in all those things, right? I know some people that, they are single parenting it and they are doing a fantastic job, but the studies show that these are risk factors that can add up to adverse childhood experiences later in life. So this is a depiction by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, of showing the vast impacts for adverse childhood experiences. So there's a greater risk of injury. There's a greater risk for mental health. We see higher levels in depression, anxiety, suicide, and PTSD. We see maternal health. So not only do we see unintended pregnancies, we see pregnancy complications. There's a higher level of fetal death related to people who have gone through adverse childhood experiences. Infectious disease such as HIV and STDs, chronic diseases like cancer and diabetes. We see risky behaviors. So you're looking at alcohol, drug abuse, unsafe sex. Now, I would wager here, I see a lot of folks self-medicating. And there's a lot of reasons for people to self-medicate. Maybe they don't have health insurance, right? Maybe it's easier to access these substances than something else. But what I see is people hurting, and they do what they know to do the best way they know to do it. And until the pain of staying the same is greater than the fear of changing, people typically don't change. But when I see risky behaviors, I see somebody who is hurting and is trying to feel better. And they're so desperate to feel better for a moment that they'll risk the effects of it. And then I see opportunities. So there's a diminishment in educational opportunities and income earnings. So adverse childhood experiences, we know these numbers are from 2008. So I would strongly assume that the numbers are higher now. In 2008, there was at least a 1 in 7% chance for children to be abused or neglected in the past year. Children who are living in areas of poverty are 5 times at a higher chance of abuse and neglect. We also found that childhood abuse is more expensive. So typically, you know, as a whole, the US spends about $124 billion really supporting and treating, you know, through a variety of ways, children who have gone through abuse and neglect. Now, just in reference, this is higher than the cost of treating things such as stroke and type 2 diabetes. And so the cost of childhood abuse and neglect is absolutely weighing, and the risk is there, right? 5 times more likely, and it's happening to kids at a very, very high rate. So when we look at individual risk factors, right? Not everyone who has one of those adverse childhood experiences is going to have all of the correlations that we mentioned, but there are specific risk factors that we see a correlation for. And so those are when we have caregivers who don't understand their kids' needs or don't understand their kids' development. And sometimes this is psychoeducation. Sometimes this is being a young parent and not knowing that your kid needs something extra than what you would imagine, because how would you know if you don't know, right? How do you know the questions to ask if you don't know? Sometimes we see parenting stress. Maybe there's a poor parent-child relationship. There's not that interaction or that connection. Sometimes we see a family history of child abuse and neglect. Now, one of the programs that I work with at Peace River Center is called Home to Stay, and they're a reunification program. So when kids have been removed by DCF, you know, by the child welfare system, and it's time to be reunified, Home to Stay can go in and really just stand in the gap and say, well, let's leverage everything that we have to fortify and strengthen your family so your kid is home to stay this time, right? And what we find working with our families is that so many times parents who are involved in the child welfare system were children involved in the child welfare system. And so you see this generational cycle of abuse and neglect, and people tend to parent the way they were parented or a close variation. And unless you know how to do better, how would you know that there is a better? We sometimes see a family history of substance abuse, mental health issues, family dynamics, as I said before, sometimes parents who are young, maybe low education, maybe being a single parent. There's all of these stressors. Parenting is hard enough as it is. When you add in these extra stressors, it just makes it harder. The next is social isolation. So if any of you, have had small children, there's a season of parenting in and of itself that is isolating. It is. And if you don't have the support system to, insulate, I guess, that isolation, it can be really difficult to even know when you need help. Sometimes we see non-biological transient caregivers in the home. So sometimes this is paramours, boyfriends, girlfriends, maybe not knowing how to be, a specific role in the life of the child, maybe not knowing what their role is. Sometimes we see parental thoughts and emotions that tend to support or justify the treatment that they're giving the child. Well, this is how I was parented. Well, this is what I know works for my other kid. Well, and one approach may work for the other kid, but when you're dealing with a child who has high needs, when you're dealing with a child who has a mental illness, you really have to look at that particular child. Every child is different, and every child is going to need a little something different from you as a parent, and that may include the way that you parent that child. Not everything is going to work for every child. Sometimes we see a lot of disorganization in the family, maybe violence, maybe domestic violence. All of those things are added risk factors whenever we're looking at a child's resilience. There's also community risk factors, right? So community violence, high crime, high poverty, high unemployment rates, where there's a large population of alcohol outlets, poor social connections. But we really do our best with kids that we're serving at Peace River Center to look at that holistic approach of, tell me what your life is like at school. Tell me what your life is like at home. What do you do after school? So we look at all of the pockets of their life to see where are the risk factors. And sometimes the risk factors are those windows of time between when the kid gets out of school and when the parents or the caregivers get home from work. So that pocket of time, if they're in a neighborhood that's not conducive for, healthy decisions, that's what you're looking at. And so then what we do is figure out, okay, well, what are the community resources available to reduce that risk factor. And maybe it's the YMCA, maybe it's another community resources, maybe it's the Boys and Girls Club, something to plug in that time to reduce the risk factors associated with that specific family. So there's lots of protective barriers. I've talked about some really sad things. So let's talk about the good things. Just because the risk factors are there does not mean that there is a definite, negative thing that's going to happen. When there is a supportive family environment, it makes a difference. When you have parents who want to learn, who want to grow, who want to learn how to parent their child, and they're willing to be nurtured, that makes a difference. One of the biggest things is household rules, right? So a child, a family, they need to know, what are the expectations in this home? What are the expectations in the community? Kids are big on routine. They are big on structure, and they may rebel against it at first. One of the best things that you can do in your family is create a sense of structure and routine for your child, because especially in instances of trauma, that creates a sense of security. I know what comes next. I know what's happening tomorrow. I know what time I'm eating. I know that I'm going to get to eat, right? That sense of structure and security. Stable family relationships, knowing that when you come to me for a problem, I'm going to help you, and I'm not going to do like this. Knowing that I'm here for you no matter what, knowing that I can be angry with you and still love you, and that my love for you is big enough to hold your feelings, and you don't have to worry about my feelings. Parental employment, it makes a difference whenever you have that steady stream of income. It makes a difference for that parent's peace of mind. Parental education, adequate housing, having a safe place to sleep at night, access to healthcare. All the services in the world aren't going to help you if you can't get to them, if you can't access them. Caring adults outside of the family. Sometimes you need help. And so sometimes you need help to serve as a role model, as a mentor, as a babysitter. It's just having somebody that you can call and say, hey, let me talk this through with you. And then communities that support parents and take responsibility for preventing abuse instead of doing punitive measures when parents ask for help. So here is my family. So now is the time for our story. So I told you before that my water broke at 31 weeks with my son. So this is my husband and this is my daughter. And this is when, I don't know how many weeks, I was maybe like 26 weeks pregnant, and everything was healthy. And so with Lily, my daughter, her pregnancy was completely normal. Everything was textbook. And the same with my son. And so you think, well, every pregnancy is going to be the same. Nope, they are all different. And so I wanted to share this story to show you, even when you do everything right, even when you know everything to look for, things still happen. And so everything was okay. And at 31 weeks, my water broke while I was at work. And I immediately went to the hospital and I was admitted, and they put me on bed rest until they induced him at 34 weeks. So at 34 weeks, my son was born, and he was 6.5 pounds. So can you imagine how big he would have been if he had been a full-term baby? Now I show you this to show, so he as a baby went through physical trauma, right? Because he was born so early. Now he's huge, but his lungs were underdeveloped. So he was in the NICU for a while. They had to do the air and the lights and all the things that you do for the NICU babies. I think he was like the love of all the NICU nurses because he was so big that everybody got to cuddle him. So that was like a really cool thing. But it was very difficult because, I'm in the hospital, my daughter's at home with my husband, and I'm having to explain to her why I can't come home yet. And she couldn't understand it because kids at the time were not allowed in the NICU unit, right? The NICU unit at the time, it wasn't individual families, it was one like nursery. And so she had never met her brother. And so finally, one of the NICU nurses who was smarter than me said, okay, we got to figure this out. She needs to meet her brother. And so she got to FaceTime him. So that was the first time she met him. I was in the NICU holding my son, and then my daughter got to FaceTime. And so that was a couple of days after he was born when I was able to hold him, and they were able to take all the wires off of him. And so that was really good for her because she needed to understand what was going on. Now, at the time, she was only, I think at the time she was 2.5, 3, but she didn't understand what was going on. She didn't know what was wrong with me. She didn't know why I was in the hospital, why I had all of these wires, what was going on with him, why she couldn't hold him, why she couldn't see him. And so we had to figure out a way, how do we explain to her all of this trauma without bringing fear, because we want to bring a sense of security, a sense of understanding. And so we just talked to her. We said, look, he was born early. He came earlier than we expected, and he's going to be okay, but he's not quite ready to go home. And so you're going to get to look at him every day on FaceTime, and you can ask all the questions that you want to ask, and we will answer all of your questions, and you can come see me every day. My husband would bring her every day to my room, and it was the sweetest thing. This is why you've got to have providers who are trauma informed. So I wasn't allowed to be alone with her at the time because they were still monitoring me. But the nurses would make a cot next to her. So my husband would come and she would take her naps with me every day. And the nurses would bring her popsicles, and the nurses would make a little bed for her baby dolls that she would bring in. And so we tried to bring some sense of normal to a traumatic situation. Now, what I found to be funny with her is that one of the ways that kids process things, one of the ways they process trauma is by talking about it, right? And so she's very, very verbal. And so my husband would tell me that they would be in Publix checking out, getting something. And she'd look behind her to the person in line behind her and she would say, my mom's in the hospital and my brother almost died. And the person would just look at her like, oh, are you okay? And my husband would smile and say, yep, that happened. We're okay. Thanks so much. And I never made her stop. And the reason why is because when kids need to talk about trauma, I give them an opportunity to talk about trauma. Now, I never make them talk about it when they're not ready, but it's so important for kids that are going through something traumatic that you allow them to share their trauma narrative in a safe way. But it needs to become, this happened to me and I'm able to talk about it. And it needs to be something that they're able to process to where it gets to a point of, yeah, this happened to me. And now it no longer affects me because I've processed it. And so now she can talk about her brother. She can talk about everything that happened and it doesn't affect her because it was just something that happened and she's strong and she can do hard things. Now, I will say with her, she went through a lot of regression. So she was 2.5, completely potty trained, just, the joy of my heart. And she immediately reverted back to wetting the bed at night. She immediately reverted back to baby talk. So this was a kid at 2.5 years old. She was speaking, 3-syllable words, right? Perfectly clear. Enunciation, wonderful. She went all the way back to baby talk. Excuse me. And so what I did was I took it step by step with her and I constantly affirmed, I love you. You're still my girl. And as soon as I can be home and be with you, I will. And then when we got home, one of the things that was really interesting to me is that, thinking about that chart that I showed you, she was very clingy. So if I went to the other room to use the restroom, if I went in the kitchen to get a bottle, if I went outside to get something out of my car, I would find her in the fetal position, sobbing hysterically because last time my mommy left me, she didn't come back. And maybe this time she's not going to come back to you. And so it took a good 3-4 months of constantly reaffirming, I'm safe, I'm here, that was an accident that happened and nobody knew it was going to happen. And those types of things don't happen every day, but I'm here now. And one of the ways that I combated that was over communication. And so before I left the room, I would say, okay, I'm going to go to the bathroom. You can come with me. You can come stand by the door. Whatever you need to feel safe, this is what I'm going to do. What do you need? Okay, I'm going to go to the kitchen and wash the dishes. Do you want to come in here and help me? I tried to make her be a part of everything. And at times it was tiring, right? You don't want to have to go use the restroom or go take a shower with little fingers going underneath your door, but that's what she needed to feel safe. And after, a couple of months of doing that, and I mean months of doing that, the issue completely resolved. The baby talk resolved, the bedwetting resolved, because her sense of identity was wrapped up in me and my safety was jeopardized in her mind. And once she realized I'm safe, all of those issues went away. And it was just such a nice reminder that even though I knew all the right things to do, even though I knew all the things to look for, I wasn't immune, right? And so everybody does the best that they can, but none of us are immune to trauma. None of us are immune to the effects of trauma. You do the best you can. And fortunately, I was so blessed to know what to look for, to know how to look for it, to know what to do. Not everybody has those circumstances. And so I think when you're in those situations, you do the best that you can with what you have. and be okay with asking for help if you need it, because the help is there and because the help is ready and willing to support, because trauma is hard and going through trauma is very, very hard. Now, I want to show you how they're doing now. So my son completely recovered. He still has a couple of things. He has eczema, which is very common, I've heard, with preemie babies, and he's getting through some gastro issues. He just turned 4, and so he just potty trained, which is late, typically, but because of his physical, medical trauma, he was having gastro issues. He had a really, really hard time with his gastro, and so that is, on the other side now. And so sometimes what you'll see with kids who go through, medical trauma, their milestones are a little bit later, and that's okay. Every kid is case by case, and he's perfectly fine. My daughter, she is just, the joy of my heart, and she's doing great too. And I will say there was a lot of animosity at first between her and him, because she saw him as he's the one that took my mom away. And so what did we do? We kept an eye on that, right? And we constantly looked for opportunities to reinforce, I love you and I love him, and we're together and we're a family, and let's look poised to bond. And now she's obsessed with him, as you can see in the pictures. They are the best of friends. And so even though trauma happens, there is resilience, there is recovery, there can be happy endings. You just have to do the work. And unfortunately, the work is not quick. I mean, months and months and months, sometimes years. But if you can get on the other end of it, there is that resilience and that recovery. And for both of them, you would have never known. And what was so impressive to me was after he was born, not long after we had the house fire, and she was able to completely regulate because she had that sense of security. So even with hard things happening, if you have those supportive, protective barriers, they will ground and anchor you in ways that you didn't even imagine for later on in life. So bad things can happen, trauma can happen, but it can equip you in such a way that you're not shaken the next time something happens. So I wanted to just very quickly review a few ways that we can focus on resiliency and well-being for kids and for families. The first thing, I cannot stress this enough, relationship. Relationship is the key, right? Healing happens in relationships. Nobody raises a child alone. They don't raise a child in isolation, really. And so you're doing it with the team, teachers, coaches, the people in your life that you trust and you care about. Do it together. And I would also encourage building skills. So I'm constantly doing my best to model healthy listening. And I will tell you, sometimes I mess up, sometimes I blow it. The other day, I was very preoccupied, and my daughter and my son looked at me, they're like, Mom, I need you to look at me when I'm talking to you. And I stopped and I said, you know what? I'm sorry, I was not giving you my full attention. Let's start over, because sometimes we're going to blow it. And I think the best thing as parents is to be authentic and say, I'm sorry, let me try again. Can I restart? And what I found to be true is that kids are so gracious and they are so willing to give you that chance to have a restart, because they want more than anything to know that you delight in them. They want more than anything to know that you love them. And so they're very gracious. And also it teaches
We're
them.
at 3 p.m. So
Okay.
I'm not sure how many more slides you have, but just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, thank you so much. The community role. So know the resources that are available. There's lots of resources for kids ages 5 below, screening resources, after school resources. Know the resources. And if you don't know, Peace River Center, Aunt Bertha 2-in-1, there's lots of ways to find the resources that are available to support your family. Other tips, reasonable goals, as I said before, having structure, maintaining a daily routine. Let the kids see how you problem solve. Let them see how you communicate. And it's okay for your kids to struggle through a problem with you being there to help and support. When you take away the opportunity to grow, you take away the opportunity to build resilience sometimes. So we talked already before with resiliency developed with preschool. You play with your kids, let them have fun, let them have that free time of just, decompressing and being with you. For elementary school, what we really see, that's when they become much more verbal. So be mindful of their social media, be mindful of instigating and starting conversations. I always, at dinner, I make my kids go around the table and tell me about their day, whether they want to or not. With middle school, it's harder, right? Because those academic demands. And so just make sure that you're reinforcing empathy, you're reinforcing that self-esteem, that self-confidence. You need to speak life over your kids constantly, right? But you also need to hold those boundaries and those standards to teach them how to be accountable. And the same thing with high school youth. I would also make sure, you're watching who your kids are friends with. Make sure that you know about their world, because you don't want to lose them in it. So the main thing, this is the takeaway. We want to realize that trauma happens, right? We want to recognize not only the impact, not only the red flags, but also the paths for recovery, because recovery is possible. We want to respond appropriately, and we want to do everything that we can to prevent re-traumatization, because unfortunately that does happen. But if you know what to look for, if you know what to link, you reduce that risk. So that is the end of my presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
I don't see any questions on here. Let me check. One more. So when we talk about trauma, I know you're talked about you being able to identify some of those. If someone needs care, how would they access that care, and what are some of the therapies that are available for individuals who are experiencing trauma?
Yeah, great question. So anytime someone doesn't know where to start, the best place to start is outpatient therapy. So for example, at Peace River Center, you call our access to care number and they schedule you an intake. Right now, all the services are being provided through telehealth. And so it's as simple as a phone call or a Zoom session. It could never be easier. That's the one thing about COVID. They made it so much easier to be able to start services. Now, we always start at outpatient therapy. Outpatient therapy, it's, with an outpatient therapist, sometimes once a month. It just depends on the frequency, depending on need. Now, sometimes for kids, that's not enough, because maybe the kids, maybe they have bigger high risk issues. Maybe they need a more intense family support. So that would be where my program comes in. So my program is the TBOS therapy, and it stands for Therapeutic Behavioral On-Site Services. And so what we do is we do once a week therapy with the kids, but we also can do parenting support. So right now, one of my clients, I meet with the kid every week for an hour, but I also meet with the parent for an hour individually to do that parenting support session with them. And so it really depends on what the kid needs. Now, all of our, therapists, they're trained in a variety of different modalities. One of the best things for trauma, I'm trained in trauma-focused CBT. I'm also trained in EMDR. And so these are really great approaches for helping to understand and process your trauma better. But depending on the specific stressors, the therapist and the patient would determine, what approach do we want to take? Now, sometimes the symptoms are so big that it's hard to focus on therapy. Now, what therapy is, you create a safe space really for you to dump out the content of whatever is going on. And that therapist works with you to develop a process. How do I handle when X, Y, and Z happens to me? I use these coping skills. I use these support strategies. I use this way of redirection and rethinking. It's my process. Now, if the symptoms are so big and so overwhelming and overbearing that you cannot focus on the process, sometimes medication management is a good idea. Sometimes it's consistent, sometimes it's for a short time, but the medication management, the sole purpose is to help reduce the symptoms so you can focus on the therapeutic process. Now, if you're ever in crisis, sometimes you can't wait for an outpatient therapy session, right? You need help right away. So Peace River Center has a 24/7 crisis hotline. You can call them. They can do supportive work with you over the phone. They can come out to you and do a mobile assessment. If a Baker Act is necessary sometimes, and sometimes it is, then they can help facilitate that. But there's a variety of levels depending on the specific need of the person.
Very good. I don't see any other questions. If anybody has any questions, please go ahead and put them in. But if not, thank you, Tiffani, so much for your time today and your story and all of the information that you shared with us today. I know that we'll be sending out a follow-up email, and we'll put some of those EMDR and CBT information in the follow-up email, so you have information on that as well. And we'll also be sharing the crisis line in our mental health calendar with you. But please feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions or have any other needs for presentations. So thank you, Tiffani, again, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you for joining us during Mental Health Awareness Month as we try to increase awareness surrounding mental health, stigma, and services available, as well as some diagnoses and everything there is to know. Well, not everything, but we try to share what we can. Thanks again, everyone. And thank you, Tiffani.